slid roughly 1,600 points. The S&P 500 fell more than 4.5%, and the Nasdaq dropped nearly 6%. This comes just a day after President Trump announced his new tariff plan, which begins Saturday to charge at least 10% on imports from every country. The president also announced even higher reciprocal tariffs from 60 countries he calls, quote, the worst offenders. And that those are places that export more to the U.S. than the U.S. exports to them. Mr. Trump called the plan America's, quote, declaration of economic independence. But Americans could pay the price for these new charges. With me now is Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady. Kelly, so what's just your broadest response to what the markets have done today?
Well, on a day like this, I always like to put it in perspective of how big of a loss this was. So you have to go back to 2020 for each of these three major indexes, the Dow, the S&P 500, and the Nasdaq, to see a single day that saw a greater loss. And so what does that mean? That was COVID.
Yeah.
Right? Investors are looking at today and sort of, at least in terms of how the market reacted, putting these two equal. Now, three reasons, I think, why there was so much of a sell-off. Investors really did not price in those reciprocal tariffs. It was not expected. We expected it to be a smaller amount of countries.
They guessed wrong.
They guessed wrong. Right. Exactly.
This is a big, sweeping, massive move, whereas they thought, oh, he might tinker, he might do, but... Okay.
Exactly. And I mean, we had been talking about uncertainty for the longest time, and so it really plays into that. What they're also thinking is there's going to be the potential for higher prices, higher inflation, and maybe the consumer pulls back on spending. This was also not just Wall Street looking at how companies are going to do, but how Main Street is going to do, that the consumers are going to feel pain. And you sort of put that all together, and it could mean an economic slowdown. Now, investors might be wrong. There's, daily fluctuations, and long term, this could mean good news. But in the short term, investors bet that this was not going to be good news.
Right. Now, were there sectors that, well, let's talk about the Nasdaq and technology companies. A lot of them do their manufacturing outside of the United States. The theory behind the president's plan is that this is going to bring manufacturing back to the United States. But that doesn't happen overnight. These companies have to manage that.
No, it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without billions and billions of dollars of investment. Tech was really hit hard. So the S&P 500, it lost $2 trillion, nearly $2 trillion in value. Nearly half of that came from 7 big tech stocks. And I highlight that because there's a couple of things when you think about tech and losses there. So Apple's a really good example. A lot of these companies, they have manufacturing in China. It's going to be really hard to bring that here, as you just mentioned. But it's also a big market for them. And China is likely to retaliate. And so that was what you saw flow through some of the tech stocks. But if you were looking at your 401k today, you probably also said, oh, no. And that is because tech drives the S&P 500, as I just said, and a lot of your 401k is invested in funds that track the S&P 500.
I think investors best not look at their 401k on a day like this. Kelly, thank you. We're going to go to Nancy Cordes now at the White House. First, we're going to listen to the president, who spoke to reporters just an hour before the markets closed. And here's what President Trump had to say.
I think it's going very well. It was an operation, like when a patient gets operated on, and it's a big thing. I said this would exactly be the way it is. We have $6 or $7 trillion coming into our country, and we've never seen anything like it. The markets are going to boom, the stock is going to boom, the country is going to boom, and the rest of the world wants to see, is there any way they can make a deal? They've taken advantage of us for many, many years. For many years, we've been at the wrong side of the ball. And I'll tell you what, I think it's going to be unbelievable.
Let's turn now to Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes. So, Nancy, that's a shortened version of what the president said yesterday in his much longer speech. What are you hearing from the White House here today? They did expect this, but then again, these are big numbers.
The message from the president and everyone on down today here at the White House, John, is that this is a blip, nothing to see here. The patient is going to be much better off after this operation. They simply do not accept what most economists around the world, even right-leaning economists, are saying about these tariffs, which is that they will raise unemployment and raise prices for Americans. And for the president specifically, John, at this point, after today's losses, the stock market has dropped by about 10% since he took office about 2.5 months ago. This is the kind of thing that he predicted would happen when he was on the campaign trail if Kamala Harris were to win. It's one of the worst starts for any president in the modern era.
Nancy Cordes at the White House. We're joined now by CBS News senior business and technology correspondent Jolene Kent. Jolene, you've been hearing from small businesses. What are you hearing? What do they think the future looks like?
So many small businesses feel this sense of anxiety and worry about the future. They've already, John, been struggling when it comes to persistent inflation, high interest rates to borrow money, say to build out your business, and the ongoing softening of consumer confidence, consumer sentiment overall. So that's what they're already facing, plus that uncertainty about tariffs. Now, as we look ahead, a lot of these small businesses, I'm hearing that they are going to be pulling back on orders. There's confusion about what the tariffs and how they were actually calculated will impact their ability to get supplies when it comes to basic textiles across the board. And what's really interesting is we already hear from small businesses across the board, according to the National Federation of Independent Businesses, for example, which has, by the way, often been quite bullish on the Trump administration's agenda. They have said in their recent survey, uncertainty is high and rising on Main Street, and confidence that the economy will continue to grow is fading. Now, remember, small businesses make up such a huge part of the labor market, of the economy, of GDP, of where people are spending their money. And so this uncertainty really feels different this time around. It feels like some of the promises from President Trump's campaign are really falling off, because now, with the market sliding and so much more prevailing anxiety for these small business owners, they feel like their back is up against a wall in a lot of ways. And this is interesting because it's hitting across, different retailers and suppliers and people who make all kinds of different things and do all kinds of different services, from retail to hospitality. We're feeling and hearing that the anxiety is real.
It's a great point, and the White House often makes the distinction between Wall Street and Main Street. They say Wall Street may have its own idiosyncrasies, but Main Street's where it's at. What you've just been describing is right in the center of Main Street, being felt both in Wall Street and Main Street. Jolene Kent, thank you very much. Our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm John Dickerson.